You found the Backup Wrap-Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we'll explore the critical role that tabletop exercises play when preparing for cyber incidents. Our guest, Mike Saylor, CEO of Blackswan Cybersecurity, shares his expertise on how to effectively plan, execute, and learn from these activities. We discuss the key components of a successful tabletop exercise, common pitfalls, and why regular practice is essential for building organizational resilience. He also has a few great stories from exercises that he's conducted. I think you'll find this episode quite useful and enjoyable. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of the production database that we just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. If I could ask you to take just a quick second and press subscribe or follow so that you'll always get this content, that would be great. And
leave us a comment.
What? Oh, yes.
And leave us a comment.
Yes, leave us a comment. We love comments. I'm W. Curtis Preston, a.k.a. Mr. Backup. And I have with me my vicarious movie watcher, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm good, Curtis. I would say I am a vicarious movie watcher, but sometimes I do watch movies, but they're just like the Bollywood and Hollywood movies, not the Hollywood movies.
Would you agree that you watch fewer movies than me?
I think that's a statement for the entire world. That would be factually correct.
What, just because I watched 3 movies yesterday? Two at the theaters and 1 at home.
Yeah, that's totally fine. That's normal. Yeah.
And because I watched Deadpool twice this weekend.
See, I have never met someone who falls asleep at movies so much.
Okay, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. The fact that I had to go back to see Deadpool twice for 2 reasons. One, that I really enjoyed it the first time, and second, to figure out what I missed when I dozed off in the middle.
Dozed off, and you didn't even realize you dozed off either.
I didn't even realize I dozed off till I was watching it the second time and going, I don't remember this part. It makes a lot more sense now. Well, we should probably get to our actual topic here. We once again have the CEO of Blackswan Cybersecurity, Mike Saylor. How's it going, Mike?
It's going well, guys. How are y'all?
Mike, I wanted to talk, we're in our continuing series here on basically preparing for, defeating ransomware, being able to respond to it effectively. And one of the topics that comes up a lot, it came up in our last recording, is this idea of a tabletop exercise. And we talk a lot about that a lot. And I know that back when at my previous employer, when we started showing people what an actual tabletop exercise looks like, they got really excited because I don't think that a lot of people do this. When your company's brought in, I'm assuming that these, well, let me ask you this. What percentage of the time are you brought in because there's already been a cybersecurity event?
It's more often than people call us to do a tabletop.
Say that again?
We respond to incidents for clients on their worst day more often than helping them prepare through tabletop exercises for their worst day.
Right. So you're called for the worst day. You wish you were called for the practice day.
Yeah.
And I wonder, just Prasanna, what do you think? Like what percentage of companies actually do a tabletop exercise like this?
So I'm hoping, and I'm going to be optimistic and say that probably at least 70% of companies do a tabletop exercise in some part of their organization. And it may not be a formal tabletop exercise doing
Uh,
everything end to end, but they do some form of what could be considered a tabletop exercise.
but okay, so I should have specified a tabletop
Yeah.
exercise for the purposes of cybersecurity. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I would probably say 30%.
Yeah, I think you're being generous. But our listeners are
The
better
optimist.
than the average. Our listeners are above average, and this is why they're listening to the show. So let's just start from the beginning, Mike. If somebody wanted to, they've heard that they should be doing tabletop exercises for the purposes of being able to successfully respond to a cybersecurity event, a ransomware event. What's the first thing that they should be
But
doing
wait,
if they want to? What?
before you get there, can
Yeah.
someone define what a tabletop exercise is?
Yeah. Okay. That sounds good. So, so basically, it's a practice run, right? It's a practice run where you sit out there and you well, we're going to define all the things that go into it, but basically, you're sitting around a table talking about this fake event that may happen to you at some point, and you basically talk through. It's like you know what? To go back to movies, it's like a table read, right? You're
No one
film.
knows what a table read is other
Oh,
than
shut
you,
up!
Curtis.
Oh, come. Okay, all right. A table read is where they get the script for the first time, and they all sit around a table and they just go through and read all the lines. They don't act out anything. They don't actually do the thing. So it's like a table read, but for yeah, I watch too much movies. Um, so how's that for a definition, Mike?
It's pretty good, and I think a good comparison would be, more of a simulation, like a crisis or disaster simulation, where you got actors out in the field and they've got the fake, trauma blood and makeup on, and people are actually like physically interacting, going out and getting victims and bringing them back, triaging, wrapping them up, assessing them, and that kind of thing. That's more of a true simulation
Right.
versus a tabletop, to your comparison to a script review. It's you're reading from a manual, from a script, in the same room, kind of stationary, and you
Right.
have to apply some level of imagination as you go through the script.
Right.
But yeah, it's tabletop because you're all at the same table, or
Yeah.
virtually at the same
Hence the
table.
name. Hence the name. So good. By the way, good job, Persona. I always,
That's why you keep me around.
I always forget to define stuff. So all right. So what? So back to my question before I was so rudely interrupted. Um, what? So if we're thinking about doing this, what's the first thing that we should be doing?
Well, in addition to understanding the difference between a tabletop and a simulation, understanding the kind of categorically what are the different parts of a tabletop, and there's really kind of five. There's the preparation, the planning, the execution, the review, and then the remediation. And so the preparation part, you want to make sure that you've kind of got your ducks in a row before you go to the pond. And so just jumping into a tabletop, let's do one tomorrow. You want to make it's not going to be as valuable as if you've done the analysis of, are we ready for a tabletop? And when you talk about cyber tabletop exercises are related to cyber incidents like ransomware or denial of service attacks or the theft of intellectual property or employee misconduct type of thing. All right, so what do we have in place as far as procedures and incident response plan? Do we know who the key smart people, effective people are? Do we know management's expectations for communication and escalation? Do we have management's blessing to have the authority to respond to this incident, and who's going to be in charge? And so there's the litany of, are we even prepared to do a tabletop? So that's
And for the prepared one too, Mike, I guess one of the things is like doing a tabletop exercise, you want it to be valuable, but it could potentially also be expensive, quote unquote expensive, right? Just because the number of people you're pulling in who you're pulling from their normal daily jobs, right, to do this exercise. So you don't want it to just be like a waste of time for everyone.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well,
let me ask you this. Let me argue with you and tell me why I'm wrong, and that's okay. What if the purpose of this tabletop exercise is to show just how badly we are prepared? Or poorly, just how poorly we are prepared for a cybersecurity event? There could be some value in that. It might be highly demoralizing, and I agree that persona, it would be expense. There is a cost associated with it. What do you think of that, Mike?
I've only seen that as a successful tactic one time in like 14 years. And the reason for that is, if you're the technology executive or the security executive and your job is to protect the company and make sure things can continue operation in the face or as a result of an incident or disaster, and let's say you've been asking for budget and resources for years and you're not getting it for whatever reason. So, hey, let's do a tabletop to show the magnitude of deficiency that we are currently in, right, so that management can see that we need the help. Well, what that does then is it documents your deficiency. It's now
makes it easy to get rid of you.
It's also discoverable if you have an event and you get sued. But also politically, I don't know of many technology or security executives that want to put themselves in that position of documented failure. And management is going to see that as, oh, you're just trying to get leverage. So politically, it's a bad move. I've only seen it successful one time, and that was a pretty unique situation where the management team was pretty collaborative, and it wasn't for leverage. It wasn't because they weren't getting the resources. It was a true learning experience for everybody, and it was quite a while ago. So that went really well. Everybody went into it on the same page with the same expectation of learning and identifying weaknesses. But today, in most of the environments that I experience or work with, that wouldn't go over well. The IT shop security guys, they want to practice before they go to the game.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the fact that that it's discoverable, and also that politically it is a difficulty, right? It's one thing like I've done in my backup and recovery days. I've documented, I've basically demonstrated, hey, we are unable to meet the recovery time objective that you have specified. And so that's kind of what I was thinking, but it's probably a little bit different than here. And because in there, what you're demonstrating is the deficiency of the system that you had, that you have, not the deficiency of the team itself.
Processes in place.
Yeah. So it's okay. So you're saying the first thing we do is so it sounds like we need an incident response plan before we do a tabletop exercise.
But you probably also need to figure out like what you're planning, like what scenario you're planning to run, right? So then you can make sure that you have those other steps, right?
Correct. And there's hundreds of scenarios. So one of the part of that analysis, which scenarios do we want to include on an incident response plan and then eventually train on in our tabletop? You need to do an analysis of your business. What's the most likely threats, and it could be any threat, but then what impact would that have? So you want the most likely or the likely but most impactful threats to then flesh out your playbook to then train on in your tabletop.
Is there a list of common scenarios somewhere? I know it's going to be unique for every company, but sometimes it's one of those things where maybe you're not even thinking about some of these scenarios. So how does someone approach that? Is that pulling in people like you who are experts at this and can help them figure out What are
So
some of those scenarios?
There's a lot of different exercises and activities that can happen that lend itself to good input to that exercise. And one of those is a business impact analysis. Go find out all the critical stuff in your business that helps your business run and make money. From that, then you often get those mean time to recovery type metrics, like how long can this process be offline before we start losing a lot of money, type of things. So that's great input. Well, then if you've got this list of critical things that if are unavailable impact your financials or your operations or your reputation or whatever it is, then from that you can then start to think, well, what threats would impact that process, and what are all the common themes, like internet access or email access or our phone system or this critical, our ERP or financial system, or and then just keep working backwards, and then truly just most likely, statistically most likely threats that are out there. Ransomware is huge in any environment where you've got end users that interact directly with your production environment. But ransomware has a couple of different flavors, and one is delivered via phishing emails and downloads, and the other one is delivered through unauthorized access as a result of vulnerabilities or some other weakness in your environment. So again, what's the most likely scenario there? Is it hacking into our network, or are users clicking on something they shouldn't? And what controls do we have in place, and what would the impact be? And so I'm kind of going down that rabbit hole now, but sitting back and thinking, for example, if we are a company that develops new stuff, so our intellectual property is very important to us. The threat would be insider threat, stealing our intellectual property when they go to a competitor, or nation state hacking us to get our intellectual property, or we're transferring data, whether it's backup tapes or to a cloud, or to we design the stuff, but we ship it off to a place to manufacture it, and the process for doing that. So that could all be related to intellectual property theft. Well, what's the impact? Well, I'm sure there's financial impact, there's market share impact, there's legal impact, reputation. And so is that more important than ransomware shutting down our environment for 2 weeks or a month?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Earlier you talked about, what's highly likely and what's impactful, and that you need to do a balance. And of course, there's nothing wrong with doing multiple tabletop exercises, right? Do the less likely but more impactful, the more likely but less impactful. What might be more?
You can do more than one. A tabletop exercise, it sounds like this all day, all week thing.
Right.
Most tabletop exercises last maybe an hour or two. Mm-hmm. And so if you've got the ability to allocate resources to an entire day, you might be able to get 2 or 3 accomplished.
So we figured out the how prepared we are and whether or not we're prepared to do this. We have decided the scenario or scenarios that we're going to do. What's next?
So now we need to determine the format. Is it just the core team? So the incident response lead, the subject matter experts, the stakeholders involved that would provide input and decision making, that kind of thing. And then there's the third parties, like external legal counsel and your insurance company and law enforcement. And then there's the observers, other people in management or your board, or other employees that maybe would be good to observe the intricacies of incident response and what's involved. There's a feedback on that's usually pretty good. Like, I had no idea it was that complicated. And so that there might be value there, but most organizations that are doing their first tabletop want to kind of keep it tight in case they mess up. They don't want everybody to know where their deficiencies are. But that next stage after you've determined the scenario is to identify or define who's going to participate, who's going to run and moderate this exercise. Usually that's a third party. Have an objective someone that's not been in the weeds every day and doesn't know all the intricacies, so they can ask some good questions and throw some good curveballs. Just when your team knows what all the plays are, the moderator can throw a monkey wrench in there and see how the team reacts. And then you want to make sure you have.
This starts to sound like D&D a little bit.
A little bit, and I thought that's where you were going to go earlier when you were going to explain how a tabletop went. It is very much like a role-based table-based game. And then make sure you've got a good scribe, somebody that can take good notes. And one of the things that you want to make sure you highlight are what we call the aha moments. Like, oh, yes, you can tell when there's an aha moment. And those aha moments can be good, like, hey, that's a great idea, or I'm glad we did it that way. And they could also be I didn't think of that. And so we need to capture the good and the bad and the curious. So you've got to put that kind of planning into game day. So then make sure you allocate enough time.
Deciding who's going to be there and who's going to do what role.
Right. And then some ground rules. So I always start with some ground rules, and I make sure everybody that's participating agrees with those. And one of those ground rules needs to be that this tabletop is a safe place. We're here to talk and collaborate and go through this exercise for the benefit of the company. There's no stupid questions. No one's going to be fired because you didn't know, or you challenge a decision or a comment. It's meant to be productive and constructive.
No blame, finger pointing. Yeah. So then you actually start to execute. So you found the people, the scenario, you've set the rules. Now I'm guessing you just sort of play the game.
Right. And so you start the tabletop with and sometimes it's good to provide some statistics or maybe some background information to support the magnitude or the gravity of the exercise. So maybe recent statistics on cyber or whatever that particular threat is. If you're going to invite law enforcement, a lot of times they'll bring those numbers and do a short presentation, which has always been good and interesting. You lay out the ground rules. You describe at a high level what the scenario is going to be. And then you start with step number one. So-and-so observed this, or this event happened, and it was reported to whoever, who then reviewed it, categorized it, classified it as an incident of whatever priority, and kicks off the incident response. And then you hand it over to whoever that person is and say, so what do you do next? Well, I call Jim, and this is what I do. And then you go to Jim. All right, Jim, you got the call. What do you do next? And it's truly role playing, turn by turn.
You just go down the list, right, of their playbook, if you will.
And there is a little bit of discussion. All right, so why did you do that, Jim? Or what do you think about that? Or how do you think that could have gone differently? And so there's a little bit of interaction in process, but for the most part, right. Yeah, everybody's going to talk about what their role and responsibility and activities are, and we're going to capture all that. And if it's lined up with the playbook that we came to the game with, great. But in many cases, I would say at least half, we've got some action items that come out of this to make things better.
One of the things that I've seen from common cyber events has been that it doesn't start, the cyber event doesn't start with, you get this big message on your screen, you've been attacked, right? It starts with, the West Wing air conditioner unit is not working the way it's supposed to, right? It's like you have this random thing. It's like, oh, that's odd. Why is that happening? Why it's happening is that you have an underlying security event, right? That's happening. I wonder when you do a tabletop, is that the kind of thing you give them, or do you give them a little bit more blatant, you know what's happened?
So one of the good things about a moderator that's been through a lot is that, to your point, this weird thing happened. and we want to triage this. We want to stop the bleeding, stop the incident. But at the same time, there's got to be some people tasked with determining root cause. Where's patient zero? What were the things, the symptomatic things or the observable things that could have been escalated prior to this bad thing really happening? And so to that point, and I think your analogy is a good one, is that we're not just addressing truly technology-based events and metrics and observable things. We also want to go back to the people, the eyes and the ears, see something, say something. So do we have a good security awareness program? Did Bob or Sally see that air conditioning thing misbehaving some time ago, weeks, days, months? And is there a way to, is there even a mechanism for them to report that? Because if they just make a comment to a coworker or a supervisor, well, then there's got to be a way to communicate that to people that need to know. So is there even a mechanism for that? But to your point, right. So we want to expand the value of the tabletop as far as we can without really diluting the focus. But those observable, teachable, expandable moments are definitely brought up. And so that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's absolutely, it's the moderator's job to know how far outside the true storyline we can go, how far off the path can we go and still add value to the exercise.
And so it looks like the moderator has a critical role to play in the actual execution of the tabletop exercise. How, and I know you mentioned sometimes a lot of this comes with experience. How do you even find the right moderator? Right? Because like you mentioned, you probably don't want someone who's internal, who knows the details of the systems and the inner workings. You want someone who's experienced in cyber incidences or whatever else you're focused on. But how do you, as a company, like I'm going out and seeking out a moderator, how do I know, like, what are the questions I would ask to be able to determine, is that a good moderator for my tabletop exercise or not?
Usually there's profiles for tabletop moderators. They're also call them breach coaches. And they run from the kind of the gamut from true cyber focused, former CISOs and people that have been in the trenches that actually had to wear those shoes. And then some other breach coaches are on more of the advisory or even legal side. Like one of my favorite breach coach collaborators is an attorney, and he's been a cyber attorney his whole career. He's never spent a day in IT, but he's been involved in hundreds of breaches. So he's seen the battleground and he's been through the game, and he's seen what's worked and what's not. And then based on all that experience, also giving some good advice on how to make them more resilient to future incidents. So my advice would be, and you can search, usually it's called, tabletop exercises, the service providers out there usually list it like that. And then for those that are providing the service from that company, you've got a profile, usually like a resume that you can review.
And it seems like the actual experience with actual events would be a really big, because like you said, they can draw on all of these different things that have happened to them, both in terms of how the event got started and things that happened throughout the event, right? It's like, okay, well, now you just lost power or whatever types of things that happen throughout a cyber event. You've got to have a lot of experience to be able to draw on those kinds of things.
And I'll make an example that you can probably truly relate to, because that backup tape drive works the same every day, and it works good. And the hiccups. And I guarantee you that does not work the same on the day you have an incident. You've got to restore something. That's a Murphy's law.
Yeah.
And so you've got to have someone moderating your tabletop that's familiar with how Murphy's law works.
Yeah, I often say that the success rate of backups is inversely proportional to the degree to which you need that data. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So we've done our event, right? And you had a good scribe, captured those aha moments. Now what? And no one cried. Maybe somebody cried.
I've had that happen.
I'm sure. This is so hard.
Yeah.
I can just see that.
Well, one of the things too, and before we get off of the execution part,
okay,
I want to stress the importance of accountability. So even though it's a safe place, what we don't want to happen is walking through a scenario and somebody go, well, let's just assume we do have that and let's move on. Let's just assume we need to move, we need to work through this because we need to know how it's going to flesh out. So I want to stress that when you're playing this game, don't just assume, right? Because, and I've got a case study where we assumed, or I say we, it was the response leader, let's assume we have that and let's move on. And kind of not directly, but I tried to passively come back to it multiple times during the tabletop. And each time it was met with, let's assume we have that and move on. Well, not 6 weeks after the exercise, they actually got hit with that particular incident in real life. And that assumption really came back to bite him because they assumed this in the tabletop. It was not captured as a remediation item. And that was one of the downfalls of their
and it didn't exist. That assumption was false.
Right. That reminds me. Yeah, I like that. And I can see that. I can see wanting to do that. It's like, okay, we don't have that person here. Let's just assume that we have the thing, right?
Nope. He's not here. What do we do if he's not here?
Right.
He's on vacation. Yeah. He gets hit by a bus.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and I've done that too. All right, you're the incident response team leader. Let's go through this. And halfway into the incident response, I go, all right, you fell sick because that pizza you ate for lunch took you out. And so who's the assistant coach? And we actually ran into a problem there because 3 people thought they were the assistant coach. And so there was a conflict of, right, who's going to take charge. But then, so after we finish the execution and we've got documentation and good notes, we want to review, we want to debrief. We want to make sure that what we heard, what we collected, what we documented was concise and accurate. And then naturally, as maybe I'm saying something, I'm responding to something, or I'm walking through my activity or my playbook, and my part's done. I hand it off to you, and now I'm listening to your response. Naturally, as people with responsibility and instant response, I'm going to think about what you're saying, and well, what could I have done different, or maybe I've got thoughts about what you're saying. So the debrief gives an opportunity for the participants to add more comment or thought, or something came to mind, or let me add to that, or let me correct that. Mm-hmm. And so the debrief is important before everybody leaves. We want to capture all that before the end, before people go back to their day job. All right. Well, then the scribe and the moderator need to collaborate over the coming days to make sure that there aren't any untied strings or unleft questions. And we're going to, there's an opportunity to ping the participants one more time because maybe they also made reference to something. All right, well, let me know when you get back to your desk, type of thing. So we've got a period of time to wrap this up, and then we want to document this in a summary with detailed action items. All right, this is what came out of the tabletop. We need to update this. We need to find a resource when Bob doesn't show up. We need to talk to our insurance company about having a good contact. We need management's approval for when to involve law enforcement, whatever it is. Yeah. We've got this action plan. We need that stuff to be addressed. It came out of this incident response as things that we need to do to be more effective. It has to get done. And that is as important as conducting the exercise, because you now know where your weaknesses are and where you need to improve in order to be effective. Without that stuff, you're going to fail the response to whatever that incident is. And more than likely, back to Murphy's Law, that particular incident that you just trained on that you didn't fix is going to happen sooner than it would have.
Yeah. Well, you know what? This brought up a thought for me. We talk a lot about doing disaster recovery testing, and So my question is, what is there a pass or fail for a tabletop exercise? What's considered a success I would think, well, I don't know. I'll stop talking. What would be considered a success, and what would be considered a failure?
There is, and defining what success is would depend on what the incident is. So if it was intellectual property theft, success would be determining how it happened and having enough evidence to prosecute whoever did it, right? That would be success. Ransomware, success would be 100% or majority, recoverability without having to pay a ransom, while also figuring out how the ransom infection happened. That would be ideal success. But there's levels of success as well. Simply getting the company back up and running with minimal financial impact would be considered success. And so defining success is one of those criteria that you definitely want to lay out at the beginning of an incident. Based on what's going on, here's what we're going to focus on. This is what our target is. And that's collaboration with management. That's not just IT, setting the bar and shooting for that objective. It needs to be collaborative. And then absolutely there's failures. Failure is not being prepared, not understanding the business, not having identified the right resources that you need to be effective in response, not getting along. I've seen that several times in an incident response tabletop. People just, I'm not working with you anymore. I quit. I haven't had it and I quit, but there's definitely people that have had some contentious or, some animosity, and you put them in a room and you're pointing fingers. All right, you're next. And they're like, yeah, I'm not playing anymore. And I've seen that.
Wow. Yeah, that would be.
That brings to light a risk that needs to be addressed. Maybe that person shouldn't have that responsibility.
And I think at least doing this exercise, right? So you've gone through this entire process, you figured out the remediation steps or the gaps that you have today. I think that's such a huge step forward for a company, because now you can figure out, okay, how do I address those? What are the skill sets I need to bring in? What are things I need to modify my processes in order to make sure that I am able to recover from some of these incidents?
And it's really huge too in very well established environments that have never been tested. They're so complacent with how everything's always worked. Everything's fine. Everything's worked well forever. I've been here for 20 years. Well, that's great. It's worked well from your perspective without any outside influence. Let's add some of that. Let's add some new perspective, outside influence, and see how things go.
Yeah, I talking about, the way people interact, it would seem, and while it is a safe space, you're observing, and you get to see how different people do under pressure. I'm thinking back to, I used to work for this company that used to ask really bizarre interview questions. Not as bizarre as the, like, how to put an elephant in a refrigerator. I don't know if you're familiar with that series of questions. They were more like, you're writing a shell script, and instead of pound bang ben sh at the top, you put pound bang ben echo. What would happen, right? And it was it had two purposes. One was, if you could successfully answer the question, then it showed that you had a really good knowledge of internals. But if you couldn't answer the question, it was just as important to see how you responded to that. Right. And and we had interviewers just walk out. Like, this is a stupid question. No one would do that. No one would put Ben Echo at the top of the shell script. This is stupid. And they would just literally walk out. Okay, you failed the interview. Right. And so I would think that, you talked about dynamics. You talked about people getting, animosity to each other. And I'm sure that at some point there, even though we're not supposed to, I'm sure there's been some yelling in a few tabletop exercises. Would that be a fair assumption?
There has. And well, not yelling, but definitely raising the voice.
Yeah. 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 And so I think the only truly failed tabletop exercise, in my opinion, would be one that you just never do. right? And I think that that's what multiple people, I think that's what a majority of people are doing or not doing, is that they're just not doing these for fear of those things, for fear of being exposed, for fear of whatever. But the only thing I can say to them is, well, it have you seen Glenn Ross, the movie?
No.
Okay. If you watch nothing else, just watch the opening scene with Alec Baldwin. And there's a lot. He's yelling and screaming at these salesmen, and he said, one of the lines he says is, you can't handle what I'm saying to you right now. If you can't handle this, how are you going to handle the abuse that you get when you go out on a sales call? Like, if you can't handle a tabletop, imagine an actual cybersecurity event where you didn't do a tabletop and you're not prepared at all. Which
right.
I think is the majority of situations, right?
I'd agree. But I think there's a misconception there in that tabletop is this point in time thing that they're afraid of because they're afraid that they're going to fail. But really, the intent of doing a tabletop requires that you do some planning ahead of game day so that you're better prepared to play the game. And that preparation is where someone like me would really walk you through what you need to be successful in a tabletop and make sure that that's in place before we go play the game.
Yeah, and I think if you define the success of the tabletop, is a successful tabletop helps uncover weaknesses issues that we can then go address, right? That would be a successful tabletop. Yeah,
it would. And it's expected. Every tabletop I've ever done has had opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, it's just like when Prasanna, that I say this a lot, that when we used to do disaster recovery exercises, we define success as, because we would do a DR test where I was the one in charge of backups, but I was not the one running the DR test. A success was they made it from A to Z using nothing but my documentation and never having to ask me a question. Never once did we succeed by that standard, right? Everyone has deficiencies in every part of IT in the job of doing this. And I like, by the way, you said it's a lot of people see it as a point in time. Another thing is that you don't just do one tabletop and then move on. You do regular tabletops. What do you think is a good frequency for people to do that?
As often as possible. At a minimum, once a year, you pick, because once a year is really as often as collectively the business reassesses itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we update our strategy, both on the business side and the technology side. That's where we look at if we've got audit work or risk assessments, we look at all those things. So once a year is common. Twice a year would be great. Quarterly would be amazing. And if you're doing them quarterly, you're really cutting this down to, a well-oiled machine. Doing them once a year, that's probably 2 hours on game day plus maybe an hour or two of planning ahead of, and then all the logistics of, people schedule and everything. But if you do them quarterly, you can usually it's a smaller group. You can really focus tactically on whatever the scenario is and just record it in a team session, and you don't even have to have a scribe. And it becomes this scheduled event that you just, it's like going to practice.
Yeah, you build up the muscle memory.
Did you just say muscle memory?
I did say muscle memory.
At the same time? Look at that. I love it. That's a great way.
The other thing to consider with tabletops is it's actually a benefit in a couple of ways. And especially if you expand the participation to include your insurance company and law enforcement and some others, you're improving the perceived effectiveness of your organization to people that want to help you. And you learn something too. Like a lot of organizations think, I'm not going to call my insurance company until I think I'm going to have a claim, or I can't recover, so I'm going to have to pay the ransom. So I got to call my insurance company. But if you ask the insurance company, when should we call you? They're going to tell you as soon as you think you have a problem. because we've been through a lot of this stuff, and we can also help guide you. And let's say Bob didn't come to work that day and he's on your incident response team and he's your database expert. Well, what are we going to do now? Well, your insurance company probably has a vendor on their approved list that's a database expert that can help you. And so they're a great resource. And a lot of organizations don't realize, or they're hesitant to involve their insurance company when something bad happens. They're afraid it's gonna ding them, like getting your windshield repaired. They're afraid it's gonna impact their premium next year or whatever. But really, what it's doing is adding value, and there's a perception there from your insurance company that you guys are doing what you're being diligent ahead of a true incident happening.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you once again, Mike.
You're welcome.
All right. And thanks, Prasanna. You enjoying this?
I am. I'm learning something new. It's kind of fascinating.
I love learning. Learning.
You know, whenever I think about tabletop exercises, for some reason, I think about the game Battleship. For some reason.
You sung my Battleship. I like it. All right. Well, thanks again to our listeners. We love you. You're why we do this. And that is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.